Welcome to this week's weekly wisdom webinar series. Thank you so much for joining, people. Very much appreciated, very grateful. Firstly, let's pay our respects, and of course, let's recognise the traditional landowners of this land. Thank you so much for their wisdom, their innate knowing, their gnosis, who they are, who they've been, who they are continuing to become. Thank you so much for joining, people. Tenet 8 of the sovereign leadership model. Tenet number 8 of the sovereign leadership model. One moment. And we're speaking today to self-realization. We're speaking today to the power of being self-realized. Now, this is a very complex term. It's a very powerful, empowering term or state. And it is something that has been discussed and also understood throughout the ages. So today's definition is really, or today's webinar will speak to the cross-cultural understanding across different eras and epochs and times with respect to what self-realization really means, what self-realization means to us as humans, and what it means to the sovereign leader, what it means to us evolving and expanding and really growing as people, as individuals, but also as a collective. Now, self-realization is very much linked and connected to self-actualization. In some schools of thought, self-actualization, self-realization are one and the same. I've separated these two. I've created two tenets as part of the sovereign leadership model, and I've got self-actualization. We'll actually speak to that next week. It makes sense to follow suit. And I have self-realization as an individual tenet. And look, there's a couple of reasons as to why we've done that, why I've taken that path. And that will become evident today, but it will become evident after next week, or the next tenet, which is the 9th tenet, which is self-actualization, more so. But we're really going to focus on self-realization today. The term itself, self-realized, is a cross-cultural term, and I will define cross-cultural. Cross-cultural really is an experience or a philosophy and ideology, something that really transcends one culture and is found in various cultures at various times, but also simultaneously at the same time. So the term self-realization, or the process of moving through a phase of self-realization and understanding it ideologically, philosophically, experientially, spiritually, psychologically, psycho-emotionally, culturally, collectively, is something that has occurred throughout history across varying cultures. So cross-cultural really just means events or experiences or ideologies that are held or that take place cross-culturally over various diverse cultures, either at the same time or around the same time, around the same epoch or era, or at different times as well. And what this tends to do as well is it tends to hold and demonstrate value, intrinsic value, but also innate wisdom within the paradigm of understanding self-realization, which is very, very important to grasp, because when we start to go very deep into self-realization and what self-realization is, we begin to actually, today's webinar in particular, will pull various definitions throughout history and speak to self-realization in this way. And the reason why we're going to do that is because it is a very complex subject matter. It is a very deep subject matter. Self-realization is something that we're speaking to intellectually today, from a personal experience. Maybe I've had snippets of deep postures, or I'd assume deep postures of feeling self-realized. But again, is that the case? Probably not. What we're really speaking to, what I'll be speaking to today, is the intellectual understanding of being self-realized, because experientially, to move into that state, one must progress through a great deal, endure a great deal as a human being. And again, depending on what schools of thought you follow, some will say, from a karmic perspective, would have to have passed through many different lives. Again, this will unravel itself as we understand it, but we will also come to a pragmatic understanding of being self-realized. And it is intrinsically linked to expressing our potentiality. It is intrinsically linked to being acutely self-aware. It is also intrinsically linked to having a broader and deeper understanding of self at a very a profound level. Now, the individual that is self-realized is also able to sustain these states, and that's where it differs from experiencing pockets of wisdom or experiencing pockets of feeling or being immersed in states of self-realization, as opposed to actually being self-realized and moving in that state and in that space, in that dynamic, as one pleases. So self-realization is an expression, and it's an expression used in psychological terms, in spiritual circles, in Eastern religions. It is defined as the fulfillment by oneself of the possibilities of one's character or personality. So again, we're touching on potentiality there. But to make this point, we're really going to speak to potentiality a great deal more next week when we speak to self-actualization. And we'll draw in Eastern philosophy, of course, but we'll definitely mention the likes of Abraham Maslow and other prominent Western thinkers as well around self-actualization and what that actually means. In one overview, Mortimer Mortimer Adler defines self-realization as freedom from external coercion, including cultural expectations, political and economic freedom, and the freedom, of course, from worldly attachments and desires. Now, that's an interesting definition, and that does move more into the realm of a collectivist understanding of self-realization. And and this is where the differences come into play, where I like to reserve the collectivist understanding of self-realization. I like to pass that on to self-actualization. And there's a deep connection with potentiality and humanity as a collective when we speak to potentiality and self-actualization. Self-realization, and of course there's an element of self and individual there. Self-realization rather really looks at the self in relation to the self, in relation to one's understanding of their environment. Now, people, I want to be very clear here that this self-realization, self-actualization, and self-awareness, and self-awareness is a tenet of the authentic self model, is one of the 14 tenets of the authentic self model. I want to be very clear, these are complex terms, and it may feel like we're going in circles. And look, I'll be really clear and really honest. I've been studying self-actualization and self-realization for years, and I'm still coming to grips with it. And it's something that will take, I believe, a decent amount of time. It's something that masters and yogis and disciples and Swamijis, gurus, thought leaders study for lifetimes. They really do, and not only study intellectually, but study experientially and experience that experientially. So there's a lot to this. So there's a lot to absorb, a lot of deep, complex matter. We're going to touch on the various Eastern traditions and what they think and how they perceive self-realization. Pardon me, something in my eye. Sorry, one moment. And we'll move from that place, yeah? So Yogananda defined self-realization as the knowing in body, mind, and soul. But when we're speaking to knowing, we're deeply speaking to and referring to a very powerful, all-pervasive knowing. It's a knowing that we are one with the omnipresence of God. that we do not have to pray that it come to us, that we are not merely near it at all times, but that God's omnipresence is our omnipresence. There's a deep connection there, that we are just as much as part of Him now as we ever will be. And all we have to do is improve our knowing, of self, is improve our knowing of our reality. But that, see, intellectually we can speak to that with great efficacy, but experientially doing that, living that, immersing in that becomes a very different value proposition, So self-realization is complicated, it's complex, it's integrated as we are human beings. So it's an integrated, complex concept, and we are also integrated, complex beings. We at times like to simplify and reduce the human being. We like to reduce certain subject matter, philosophical dispositions and ideological dispositions. The materialist, mechanistic worldview, or even the scientific method, so to speak, attempts to reduce the world around us and simplify the world. And look, that definitely has its place, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. It's when we do it constantly and we have a one-size-fits-all model of reducing complex or deep subject matter or states of being, that we lose the potency and the power of that experience. And that's not really healthy for us. It's not healthy for helping us understand and move through and move into deep subject matter such as self-realization. Selfless love is actually an attribute of the self-realized individual. And I'll return to this later on. I hope someone reminds me to return to it, and I hope I don't forget to return to it. Well, I may speak a little bit to it now, at least to provide some substance behind that statement. You see, selfless love, and I actually want to reframe that, selfish, selfless love. And we've gone through, if you've been on these webinars for some time, and obviously some of you aren't, some of you are very new, but if you are been on these webinars for the last 2-3 months, I've spoken to selfish selflessness a fair amount and in great detail. And effectively, selfish selflessness is a state where we simultaneously care for our own well-being whilst also caring sincerely for the well-being of others and wanting to be of service, and knowing that it's not only biologically sound to be of service to others, but it's also intuitively, spiritually, psycho-emotionally, culturally of great benefit to be of service to others, whilst also evolving and expanding our own consciousness, our minds, our understanding of the world around us, etc. So selfless love selfish selfless love lends itself directly to a deepened state of self-realization. And it's that love, that unconditional love that we have for self and for others and for our reality, that contributes very strongly to a self-realized state. And again, I have to be very clear with this, because I want to ensure that I'm stepping into authenticity when I come from this place and into a state of integrity. We are really speaking to self-realization from a very intellectual perspective, or even a psycho-emotional perspective, and even a spiritual perspective, but we're speaking to it. It's not deeply experiential. But these are the beginning stages to move towards being in a state of self-realization. I make no mistake about that. I make no claims that I'm a self-realized being and I'm speaking from direct experience, because I'm definitely not. Again, it's a heightened state. It's a heightened state of being. So we have to keep that we have to take that into consideration when we're referring to that. So let's move into, I suppose, a lengthened definition or understanding of self-realization. We want to understand, what does self-realization mean? Who is realizing what exactly? And which self is being realized? And I did a video on this on social media. It was a live feed a couple of days ago. It was today, Wednesday. I think I did it on Monday. No, I did it yesterday. and we spoke to the different versions of self. So which self is actually being realized? That's what we want to know. We want to connect to that. We want to connect to that statement. What does that actually mean? And which self is being realized? Because there are different versions of self in different moments, for different circumstances, for different peer groups. Now, what we want to attempt to do is to ensure that authentically there is a streak or streaks or elements of our true nature within every different discussion or interaction or social setting, because that ensures transparency and authenticity in all our behaviors and actions. But again, it begs the question, which self is being realized? What does the word self actually signify? Today is a lot about questions, asking deep questions of self. And it's not for me to answer or for someone else to answer for you. It's for you to not even answer yourself, but to search, to journey into self deeply. That's the power in all of this, is that journeying process, is that seeking. That is where we become self-realized. There's no end point that we're moving towards. The process itself is self-realization. And we need to understand that, yeah? So as with all philosophical, psychological, or spiritual concepts, our understanding of this term is relative to the level of our own personal and collective evolution. And that's a very, very interesting vantage point to come from. The word self is another way to basically refer to our subjective existence. So I'm able to say self to distinguish and identify between the various elements in my environment. In other words, to distinguish between that person or you or my mother or my father. And we can make reference and we can also have context and we can also discuss openly. But the discussion is really symbolic of understanding. And understanding leads to ultimately and through processes of evolution, enlightenment. Here, the one who exists is not merely an object for another. He or she is a subject to themselves. So the word self, whilst used in various contexts, essentially refers to our sense of identity. It allows us to embrace the self or embrace ourselves and connect to ourselves so that we view ourselves of worth, of value, enough to explore the chasms of our own being, yeah? Everything that exists has self. It is self that makes anything be what it is. However, to truly grasp who that self is, we need to be self-realized. So what this begins to, what we are unfolding with here, what we are unfolding with, what we're speaking to is that self-realization is not an end state per se. There are different levels of self-realization. There are deeper levels, there are more profound levels of self-realization. But what is important to understand is that by simply acknowledging the self and recognizing our value, we are moving in circles of self-realization. So before it is complete, there are levels to self-realization. It is not always black and white. It's not a rigid structure or a rigid state. If one exists in a poor relationship with one's self-identity, lacks reflective consciousness, or is simply unconscious or unaware, one is too underdeveloped to realize oneself. There'll be an understanding of self, but we call that more a very broad or surface level or shallow awareness of self. And it's a very rudimentary, basic awareness of self. But when we're speaking to self-realization, we have to move into a deeper understanding and respect and reverence for our consciousness, for our understanding of self, for our understanding of observing who we are, observing our thoughts, observing ourselves, observing the world. And again, very, very complex. So as that self evolves effectively, as we evolve, as the best version of self continues to evolve, it grows towards higher levels of the knowing of its own pure subjectivity. So it's almost like the more we know, the less we know to some extent, and the less we thought we knew, because when we think, okay, when we're moving towards knowledge or know-so or wisdom, and we almost have a cap. So we cap what we think we know and go, okay, I'm going to know that. And then we know an element of existence or reality. But as we peek over the wall, we gain more insight. And where we thought there was a cap or a ceiling, that ceiling opens up and there's a broad, wide sky there. And it's like, wow, there's a lot more to learn out there. So self-realization involves knowing self in fullness, being connected to self in fullness, yet at the same time observing ourselves beyond what I call our cultural cloak or cultural clutter. So it really, and I really like that term, cultural cloak and cultural clutter, of course, the terms I've been using. Cultural cloak I haven't been using for that long. I think it sort of came to me not long ago. Maybe someone else has said it. I'm sure I'm not the first to say it. But our cultural cloak, which really masks our ability to be authentically ourselves because we're so attached to the collective or mainstream socio-cultural norms that we lose our true identity with self and connection to self. And self-realization really moves beyond the cultural self. With self-actualization definitely does include, in my view, a deep aspect of the collective. And we'll go into that, of course, next week. But when we remove that cultural cloak and that cultural clutter that really occupies us deeply, we learn so much more about who we are. And we move deeply into the realms of being tremendously self-realized. Again, guys, for some of you that have just joined us, coming in late, of course you get a replay, but I want to reiterate the complexity and the highly integrated nature of this term and of this state. Each moment is a different experience of self depending on internal and external dialogue, situation, interaction. It is an exciting roller coaster, some days more interesting than others. Yeah, absolutely. Most definitely. And look, that's part of being self-realized, part of that state or moving towards or in or that state of being self-realized is inclusive of understanding that our lives will fluctuate tremendously, and that's okay for that to occur. Yeah, it really is. So Ramana Maharshi explains self-realization as a direct link to the question I am, or who am I, rather. And Ramana Maharshi's teachings on surface level are just so simple. He basically asks one question of self: who am I? That's it. I can't tell you how simple his teachings are, yet how profoundly complex that question is. And it is intimately and intrinsically, in my opinion as well, linked to the process or processes of self-realization or moving towards being a self-realized being. When we ask the question, who am I? The true self becomes obvious eventually. Key word, operative word, eventually. Look, and there are benefits to asking quality questions, because who am I is a quality question. The quality of the questions we ask ourselves in life determine the quality of the life that we live, of course, and we know this. And effectively, what's happening is neurologically and from a neuroscience perspective, when we're asking questions, our brain, our neurons are firing, searching for the answer. It's actually irrelevant if we find the answers or discover a perceived answer or become fixed and located on a rigid answer. But rather what's important is what is happening in the brain and what is happening in the mind when we are asking really high quality questions of self, is we're developing greater insight into self and developing greater insight into the reality of that question. And that in and of itself is just so tremendously valuable, so tremendously valuable. So really self-realization is about discovering the most authentic version of self. And that's the next question. What does that mean? What is the most authentic version of self? And here it is, guys. Again, back to the caveat at the start, is that this is a highly experiential state. Of course, we can speak to it. We can speak to anything intellectually, verbally, through language and through conversation, through philosophical, ideological disposition. But it is a highly, highly experiential state. And it's a beautiful it's a beautiful thought, state to contemplate. It really is, and to ponder upon. So let's move to Sahaja Yoga. Sahaja Yoga defines self-realization as a connection with your first self, or the first encounter with reality. This gets deep and mysterious. You'll notice that a lot of this, the Eastern mysticism and the Eastern philosophy and the language around self-realization is quite mystical. Purposely done so for various reasons. One, because the knowledge is very powerful and it can only be understood by those who pursue tenaciously and consistently and sincerely and from a place of authenticity and a place of realness and a place of high moral conduct for self and the collective. But also because it is complex. It really is. So does this mean you are as a born baby, perhaps, when we're talking about the connection with the first self? What is meant by reality? What is meant by the first self? In this definition, Sahaja Yoga goes on to explain and elaborate upon that. And the first self, or the primary self, or the prime self, or our first encounter with reality, is that encounter with Godhead, that divine, authentic presence that is us without, and this is not to devalue culture or society or collective social values at all. It's not to do that. But it's to say that there are, as Plato would say, there are forms that are supersede and are more powerful than what we view here on earth and the objects that we experience in the physical realm. And these forms, the physical objects in our realm really exist because of these forms. So we're talking that a metaphysical, beyond physical matter is of great significance and of great reverence in understanding our true nature, our real nature. And I believe it is an ability to be able to transcend the material and the physical at will and move into the ethereal and so forth. There is so much more beyond our physical senses in terms of grounded reality. But again, I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole there. I want to just simply speak to what some of these traditions define, how they define self-realization, understand self-realization, and also, of course, allow you as sovereign beings and sovereign leaders and authentic, autonomous beings, do your own research, make your own minds up, contemplate deeply these experiences yourself. Buddhism defines self-realization as the awakening of the whole. Separateness is not followed in Buddhism. So for Buddhism, there is no distinct nature per se that you're either self-realized or you're not. We are all self-realized per se, but it's an awakening to that understanding of self, that we are whole, that we are not segregated, fragmented, broken beings, that we are whole. And when we realize that deeply, we recognize our power, we recognize power of being self-realized, and that's again a very interesting place to be. Sikhism is about purifying the self. It's about purification. Again, purification from the false ego, and the false ego, of course, is intrinsically linked to our environment. So again, the cultural cloaking or the cultural clutter comes into play here, because one gets attuned to the formless Lord through self-realization. Again, we're talking about formlessness, really forming, formlessness being a pivot point or being a reference point for experiencing ultimate reality. So moving away from the material to the immaterial. Indirectly, it means that self-realization leads to God realization, divine realization. And again, are we speaking to a monotheistic God with a beard that is sitting on top of the clouds? No, we're speaking to a permeating essence or energy that really allows reality to be contemplated, but really is responsible for consciousness, that permeating truth, consciousness. Western esotericism integrates a broad variety of traditions. And this is quite interesting. It views self-realization as the ultimate goal of a human being, or being a human being. So it views it as an end state, but also values the process, most definitely. It views self-realization as the ultimate goal of being human, attaining permanent happiness and complete independence and freedom from all worldly bondage, removing the cultural clutter and the cultural cloaking, moving away from the material into the immaterial. And you see this underlying theme of material versus immaterial, so to speak. Not that there's no value to the material, because to know the immaterial, we must experience the material. So there's tremendous value there, and vice versa, of course. But in this view, true happiness is the result of self-realization. And look, whilst I agree with elements of that statement, I believe that happiness, fulfillment, meaning, joy, understanding, awareness, realization, actualization can most definitely be found through the material, through the physical, and in moments, experiential moments of the physical. It is not limited to an immaterial state, nor is it limited to those experiencing God only experiencing permanent states of self-realization. I think we can have fleeting moments in and out. So that's a very interesting point to consider, of course. According to Om Swami, self-realization is not an instantaneous act. And this is, we'll talk about this in a moment, but we may have an aha moment, but it is mindfulness, consistent, persistent mindfulness that allows us to navigate the world with the utmost awareness of our verbal, mental, and physical actions and states. It is one thing to grasp that we are not just the body, but it is another thing altogether not to react when someone hurts us or when we are triggered physically, emotionally, psychologically. We may recognize that anger destroys our peace of mind, and of course, but to remain calm no matter how strong the provocation. That is real realization. And there, people, we're speaking to a more pragmatic, practical understanding of what self-realization is our ability to not be triggered and not react in the face of danger, not danger, because to react in danger is a natural human instinct, and it comes from our complex reptilian brain. It's actually necessary for survival, but rather to not react to painful situations or challenges, but to rather respond very acutely and very consciously from an aware vantage point. That's one example of that. And as we consistently do that, we become more and more realized of the true nature of self. And that is a being that is hyper intelligent, emotionally intelligent, spiritually intelligent, physically intelligent, cognitively intelligent, cosmically intelligent. So I really resonate with Om Swami's definition or understanding of self-realization from a pragmatic, practical perspective, yeah? Self-realization has an implicit sense of meaning. Yes, it does. The basic element common to experiences of realization is a sense of not being concerned about reality. Wow. Imagine getting to that place where you are not concerned about reality. You know, there are plant medicines that can assist the mind in transforming the physiology of the brain, the neurology of the brain temporarily, to allow us deep insight into, wow, varied states of the reality. Very interesting. So it's a sense of not being concerned about reality, of not being concerned about who you are. You have transcended the cultural egoic self in that respect. Again, very, very interesting. We're talking about transcendence of ego identity and ego self in relation to the cultural world that we live in, into the world around us. It becomes a very different state that we are accustomed to, yeah? And this understanding involves ego, deeply involves ego, or moving away from ego, yeah? So that's again, a very interesting proposition. So there's a sense of certainty about yourself and about your perception of reality when we are self-realized beings. It also manifests as a sense of completeness, back to that wholeness, that state of wholeness. For was it Yogananda that spoke to wholeness, completeness, a sense of things making sense, a sense of having meaning to yourself, to your life, and to your world without necessarily knowing what the meaning is. There's a deep faith and understanding, a deep innate wisdom that can't necessarily be intellectually explained, but it is understood through processes of connecting to the wholeness of who we are and the wholeness of life. Everything has an implicit sense of meaning, value, and preciousness. There is no questioning of it. We're talking about purity of fulfillment, purity of meaning. It's well beyond happiness. It's a state that is bliss. It is a state that is real. It is a state that is open and true. Our lives originate from this sense of meaningfulness. So we go back to thinking about that real self, that first order or primary self. This is what we're talking about. It's almost like a tabula rasa, blank slate. That's the true authentic self. So our life originates from this sense of meaningfulness, significance, and preciousness that is implicit and not questioned. Your life, your action, your activity, and creativity originate from the pure and certain sense of significance to your world and who you are. Wow, fuck. Heavy, really heavy. This is why I'm so deeply connected to this, the pursuit of immersing in this state and understanding this state so deeply, experientially, fully, wholly, creatively, implicitly, to connect to that preciousness of life and the significance of who we are as human beings. And again, that deep, intrinsic, intricate connection to the self, to us as humans, to our potential, to our infinite capacity and potential to be in that state of self-actualization, which is so deeply connected to what we're speaking to right here and right now. So what does realization of self require? And what I mean by this is, what characteristics could we implement in understanding what self-realization requires from us as humans, from a human construct perspective, from a behavioral perspective? We're talking about love, selfless, selfish, unconditional. A dedication to self, to cause, to understanding the world around us. Commitment to our path, commitment to moving towards wholeness. Wholeness is another characteristic as well, where we're not fragmented, we're not broken, we are whole and authentic and integrated in our practices. We own our dark side, we own our shadow self. We're devoted, we're deeply devoted. Devoted via mechanisms of faith as well. Intrinsic faith. We're aware human beings. We're acutely sensitive to our environment, to ourselves, to our inner voices. We're resilient, we're tough, mentally, emotionally, psycho-emotionally, spiritually, physically tough, because we require that to pass through the challenges of life, through the arduous difficulties of life. We're persistent. We are persistent human beings. We're tenacious in our delivery to self, in understanding and wanting to understand self. And of course, we are understanding. And this is a central faculty for liberation. In fact, being understanding is liberating ourselves from ignorance. And that is what awareness is as well, is liberating ourselves from ignorance. Because understanding is so important, because all that is left is our subtle capacity for discriminating what is manifesting, what is true, and what is false. Think about that. Our understanding is a very careful discernment towards identifying what we need in our lives, what works, what is purely based in the ego, it's physical, it's material, it's survival based, and what is more based in the spiritual and the ethereal. Now, let me be very clear. The physical is not less or worth less or has less value than the ethereal or the spiritual component or aspect or expression of self. But rather, it is blending the two in this wonderful symbiosis. That's where power comes from. So really what we're seeing here is that self-realization is ultimately self-annihilation. Wow, annihilation of the ego, annihilation of attachment to the material fully, to the cultural cloaking of our society. We don't gain anything. Rather, we are going to lose everything. That's what self-realization is. We're not gaining. We're not gaining a state or a personality or a character type or a skill. We're losing. We're dropping it all. Now, imagine that. Dropping all that you are, your personality, your character, everything that you know makes you real, detaching fully from that, experientially detaching from that, and not being that person anymore. Then what are you if you're not that? Who am I? Ramana Maharshi asked, who am I? Wow, man, this stuff gets me excited. We lose the concepts of our mind. We one after another, one category after another, people, objects, values, cultural nuances, social norms and expectations drop ever so hard when we are on the path of deep, profound self-realization. Take a breath to soak that in, people. Soak that in. Soak that reality, that truth in. We drop, we detach, we lose, loss is that word loss. It infers pain, it infers bad, it infers negative, but it's not always the way, because when we drop all that stuff, the real self shines bright. And yes, part of the real self is all that cultural clutter, that cultural cloaking, that our relationships, our interactions, our expressions. But there's something that underpins all that allows us to experience that, and that is consciousness. And effectively, that's what we're getting to, the essence and the truth of our consciousness. Wow. When all the concepts and all the categories are gone, only the non-conceptual awareness, which is a field of pure consciousness, remains. That's what we're just speaking to now. This spontaneously dissolves into its underlying ground, absolute non-being and the total absence of being. This non-being, when we recognize when we recognize it as the ground and inner secret, the foundation, the inner secret of all reality, when we recognize that it is the night of reality, the inner of the inner, this is the guest. That's interesting. That's so interesting. What does that mean? Does that mean we simply fluctuate between different versions of self or different states? Does that mean that being self-realized means we can transmute, transmorph into anything or anyone? What does that say for our consciousness, or what is consciousness? Back to who am I again? Ramana Maharshi asked, who am I? Ask yourself, that's the only question you need to ask yourself. Wow, that's powerful. So feeling self-realization, and it's felt experientially as an exquisite sense of intimacy. It really is. And it's completely intimate within and with its reality. The intimacy is complete because there is no mediation in the self's experience of itself. Powerful terms, powerful words. We feel an artful stillness and silence, a peace beyond all description, a complete sense of being truly in alignment with our authentic selves. And that artful stillness and silence, which is, of course, one of the tenets of sovereign leadership, it allows us to connect deeply. It's one of the hows, it's one of the how-tos, one of the many how-tos for being on the journey of self-realization. We feel directly intimate with every atom of our consciousness, completely intimate with and mixed with our true identity. The contentment, is like settling down peacefully at home after eons of restless and agonizing wandering. Clarity and peace beyond the conceptual confines of time and space occur. And we can connect to this, connect to these words. We learn so much through words. We learn so much through being present and listening. Listening. Here, listening with here, listening with here. Deep understanding and empathy associated with the manner in which we move through reality is definitely a stepping stone towards experiencing deep self-realization. Wow. I've really enjoyed. I'm going to get some questions now, guys, and we'll wrap it up there because we don't have much time for questions. I mean, again, it's one of those. Look, all of the tenets are, but one of this tenet in particular is just one of those tenets that we can just speak to for so long, days and days. And it really is an intricate part and an integral part of the sovereign leadership model, hugely. I want to, of course, be very clear that this is only the beginning of understanding self-realization. So let's move to some questions now. This is every time I speak to this deeply, I have to actually get back into my body right now because I'm taken away with the words, and I'm taken away. If you're anything like me, you're deeply connecting to and resonating with these words right now. And it's powerful. It's really powerful stuff. But let's get into question in the first question. Yeah, first question. So, first question. I'll put this in. How do we attain self-realization? Well, I don't know if you're asking the right person, but I do appreciate the question because it's a powerful question. Now, look, I think we definitely covered some of that journey, and I think it's actually quite different for everybody. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I think and feel that it's a lifelong journey, and it could be, depending on your ideological disposition or your belief systems, it actually could be a multiple lifelong journey, multiple karmic lifelong journey. The first step is really pay attention. Be acutely self-aware, but before that happens, we must be asking questions of self. We must be in states of self-inquiry and a broadened sense of awareness as well of self and our environment and who we are as people. So it's a lifelong journey is the answer, but being aware, asking questions, reading, experientially immersing ourselves in silence, in other words, meditation or quiet time with the self, asking key quality questions. How do we attain self-realization? I don't know if those are the answers, but I'll tell you what, you're going to gain some deep insight into self, and self-realization is definitely part of the journey of self-realization, yeah? Next question. Is it really something that everyone can achieve or live through? That's a great question. Look, and again, I think it depends on your belief systems. If you have a belief system that we have multiple lives and that you believe in the karmic journey of self and of selves, and you believe in multiple lives, then look, the reality is, the answer is yeah, most definitely. If you don't and you believe in one life, and one physical manifestation of life, and then you may also believe in a permeating ethereal energy, or you believe in an essence or a soul, but that soul once entered into one physical manifestation of self, it then dissipates or moves into another realm of existence, whatever that may be. Or you may not believe in the soul, you may be purely atheist and not believe in any immaterial, or you may be in an immaterial reality, or you may be agnostic. Look, we will depend on those belief systems, but if you do believe in simply one life, one person, there is no spirit, etc., you're probably going to struggle to believe in self-realization to some extent. But to answer that question, is something that everyone can achieve or live through? From that vantage point and that premise, no, because not everybody develops the capacity or the yearning to explore self at deeper levels. We just don't do it. We all don't just do it. People on this people here right now on this webinar. We're seekers, we're question askers, we're journeying into self, we're journeying into reality, we're journeying, we're moving, we're shifting stuff, we're shifting understandings, previous understandings of self. But not everybody's like that. So the answer is, it's not something everyone can achieve, no. But again, if you believe in karma, if you believe in multiple lives and in infinite understanding of the universe, both physically and immaterially, then everyone has a chance. Everyone has an opportunity to do so. Is the ultimate goal, is it self-realization the ultimate goal of being human? Well, a lot of the traditional texts will somewhat support that notion, yeah. I believe in evolving end states. I don't necessarily believe in definitive end states or rigid end states. So is it the ultimate goal of being human? I think it's an integral and intricate part of being human, and I think it is absolutely necessary if we wish to gain deeper insight into self. Is it the ultimate state? Again, I'm not sure. I'm figuring that out. I'm coming to a conclusion there. And will my conclusion be a rigid conclusion? Probably not. It'll be an evolving conclusion, which will obviously always be subject to transformation and change as we progress. That is the vantage point that I take on life. So yes, is it the ultimate goal? Interesting. You're going to have to experience and experiment with that. When I looked through these questions actually during the week, I was laughing to myself because I sort of knew that the answer I would always push the answer back on the viewers or the person asking the question or our audience, because that's really the nature of this topic or this subject matter. It's very experiential, it's very personal. Well, it's felt personally anyway. Are self-realization and self-actualization the same thing? Some schools of thought say they are. Some don't. I've definitely used them as distinct tenets because I want to really emphasize potentiality and living our power in an empowered state through a framework of self-actualization. So I've separated them. So yeah, look, the elements of each other cross over. Absolutely. They're one and the same, but they're also different, so to speak. Is my answer on that. Is self-realization a permanent state of being? Wow. Okay. Great question. Depends on what school of thought you speak to. Depends on what school of thought you refer to. Is it a permanent state? Can it be a permanent state? Depends on what your belief systems are and what school of thought you follow as well, and what personal experiences you have had directly with understanding what self-realization is, or experiencing deeper levels of being and wisdom. So I really urge you to explore that. It can definitely be a consistent state of being, but with great, tremendous work, with great focus and efficacy. And again, the characteristics that we went through, the love, the dedication, the awareness, the acute sensitivity, the resilience, the understanding, the liberation of self. So yeah, that makes a big difference, yeah. Is living those characteristics consistently and inform as well, and with intention. Intention is huge. It's another characteristic I forgot to mention: intention and deliberate intention to self and to our environment and to our reality. I think last questions, guys. Last question. A couple more, but I will end it here. I think. Can we teach self-realization and can we impart it to others? To some extent, I believe that we can. I believe that we can teach elements of self-realization even through our own posturing. So if you do encounter a self-realized person, which I think if you do encounter a self-realized person is probably literally a handful on this earth, I would say. they have capacity to change and transform and evolve and expand your own life just simply by their own postures, by their inspirational states, by who they are and the intricate knowledge they have of self and reality and the wisdom they have as human beings and as spirit beings as well. So yeah, I believe we can if we choose to impart that, if the timings, the intuition, the tremendous intuition of a self-realized individual. I know when I gain deeper levels of self-awareness or awareness of self and environment, and I always think, oh, maybe I'm self-realized, but of course I'm not. The intuition that comes with that open state, being self-realized is moving into a tremendously open state, and the intuition that accompanies that openness is tremendous and very powerful, very, very powerful. So yeah, to answer the question, yeah, I think one can impart that knowledge and that wisdom and that posturing simply by their own actions. Yeah, people, I'm gonna wrap it up there. That's fantastic. I'm very, very, very blessed to be on this webinar this evening. Very excited to have spoken to it. Has felt really empowering, and I've learned so much more expressing it in this particular way, and I'm very grateful for all of you. So grateful for all of you being here to allow me the opportunity to do so, to be able to express myself in that way, and to be able to learn and be able to teach and give and receive at the same time. People, if this message has resonated with you, please share the webinar with your family, with your friends, with your loved ones, with your colleagues, with anyone you think can benefit from this, and let's develop this powerful community. Yeah, that's what we're after. We want to develop this intimate, powerful community and share our knowledge and share our wisdom. Lots of great things up ahead for Weekly Wisdom Webinar Series, and I'm very excited to be sharing all of that with you. Thank you so much for your commitment and your dedication, your enthusiasm for being here. Thank you so much from my heart to yours. Have a beautiful morning, afternoon, day, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining. It was an absolute pleasure. Really excited with this one. Just thank you so much, people. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a lovely, lovely day. Many blessings.